Josephine Stewart clutched the wrinkled letter in her trembling hands, its contents blurring as tears threatened to spill onto the fine stationery that bore her father's unmistakable handwriting, the same elegant script that had once penned bedtime stories, now coldly informed her that she was no longer welcome in the family that had raised her for 20 years. Colorado Territory, 1873. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Josephine stepped off the stagecoach, her knees weak from the 3-day journey from Boston. The western frontier town looked nothing like the refined cobblestone streets and brick buildings of her New England home, but she supposed that was fitting. After all, nothing in her life resembled what it had been just 2 weeks ago. "Miss, your trunk," the stagecoach driver called, already heaving her single piece of luggage to the ground with a heavy thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the air. "Thank you," she replied softly, pressing a coin into the man's calloused palm. The driver tipped his hat. "You need directions, miss. Ain't many young ladies arriving alone in these parts." Josephine squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, just as her mother had taught her to do in difficult circumstances, though she doubted her mother had ever anticipated this particular situation. "I'm to meet my Aunt Margaret Sullivan. She runs the boarding house." The driver nodded and pointed down the street. "Last building on the right before the creek. Can't miss it. Good luck to you, miss." She would need that luck, she thought as she gathered her skirts and began the walk toward her aunt's establishment. Her mother's sister had been something of a family scandal herself, heading west as an unmarried woman 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on Josephine that she was now following in her aunt's footsteps, though for entirely different reasons. The letter crinkled in her pocket as she walked. "Your behavior is unforgivable," her father had written. "No daughter of mine would dare to reject a match so advantageous to our family. If you cannot see reason, you are no longer welcome in our home or our lives." All because she had refused to marry Jonathan Blackwell, her father's business partner, a man 30 years her senior with cold eyes and 3 previous wives, all deceased under circumstances that had raised eyebrows among Boston society. Her refusal had come at Sunday dinner, in front of the Blackwell family and her parents' closest friends. The public rejection had humiliated her father beyond repair. By Monday morning, her trunk had been packed and a stagecoach ticket purchased. By Tuesday, she was gone from Boston, possibly forever. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch. A simple sign read, "Sullivan's Boarding House, Clean Rooms, Fair Prices." Josephine hesitated at the bottom step, suddenly afraid. What if Aunt Margaret didn't want her either? The letter she'd sent ahead had been vague about her circumstances, only mentioning that she needed to leave Boston and requesting temporary lodging. Before she could decide whether to proceed or flee, the front door swung open, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was tall and angular, with streaks of silver in her dark hair that was pulled back into a simple knot. Her face bore the lines of someone who had spent years in the harsh western sun, but her eyes, the same deep blue as Josephine's mother's, were kind. "Well, are you going to stand there all day, or are you coming in?" the woman called, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Aunt Margaret." Josephine ventured, "The very same, and you must be Josephine. You look just like your mother did at your age." Margaret descended the steps and took Josephine's trunk handle. "Come along, child. You look half dead from your journey." Inside, the boarding house was simple but clean, with polished wooden floors and practical furniture. Margaret led her to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the creek behind the property. "It's not what you're used to," Margaret said, setting down the trunk, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. "Thank you. I can pay. I brought some money." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "We can discuss that later. For now, rest. Then we'll talk about what brought my sister's daughter all the way to this dusty corner of nowhere." That evening, after a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and cornbread, Josephine sat with her aunt in the kitchen while the other boarders retired to their rooms. "So," Margaret said, pouring them each a cup of tea, "your letter said you needed to leave Boston urgently. Your father's letter, which arrived yesterday, says something quite different." Josephine's heart sank. "He wrote to you, he did." "Apparently, I am harboring a disobedient, ungrateful child who has brought shame to the Stewart name by refusing a most advantageous match." Margaret's lips quirked in a small smile. "He demanded I send you back on the next stage-coach." Josephine clutched her teacup so tightly her knuckles whitened. "And will you?" Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Your mother and I may have had our differences, but you're my blood. I won't send you anywhere you don't want to go." She took a sip of tea. "But I would like to hear your side of the story." So Josephine told her everything about Jonathan Blackwell's proposal, arranged by her father to secure a business merger, about her refusal and the subsequent scene at dinner, about her father's ultimatum and her mother's tears as she was sent away. When she finished, Margaret nodded slowly. "Well, it seems the Stewart women still have a streak of stubbornness. Your grandmother had it too." She reached across the table and patted Josephine's hand. "You can stay here as long as you like, but I'll expect you to earn your keep." "I need help running this place, cooking, cleaning, mending, keeping the books." "Can you do that?" Relief flooded through Josephine. Yes, I can." "Good. We start tomorrow at 5. Margaret rose from the table. "Welcome to the West, Josephine. It's not easy, but at least out here, you can decide your own fate." Over the next 2 weeks, Josephine learned what hard work truly meant. Her hands, once soft and pale, became reddened from scrubbing floors and washing linens. Her back ached from bending over the cook stove, and her arms grew stronger from carrying buckets of water from the well. But for all the physical discomfort, she found a strange satisfaction in the work, and in the knowledge that she was earning her place. She also began to learn about Silver Creek and its inhabitants. The boarding house catered mainly to traveling salesmen, railroad surveyors, and the occasional prospector, but there were a few permanent residents. Mr. Finley, the elderly schoolteacher, Dr. Carson, the town physician, and Mrs. Wilson, a widow who worked at the general store. It was on a bright Tuesday morning, while Josephine was sweeping the front porch, that she first saw him. A tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the rising sun as he rode slowly up the main street. As he came closer, she could make out more details: broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest, strong hands holding the reins with casual confidence, and a face that might have been carved from the surrounding mountains, all angles and planes under the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted in front of the general store across the street, tying his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, to the hitching post. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced up, and for a moment, their eyes met across the dusty road. Then he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before disappearing into the store. "That's Benjamin Baylor," a voice said behind her, making Josephine jump. Margaret stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Owns the Double B Ranch about 10 miles north of here. Good man. Fair. Keeps to himself mostly." "I wasn't," Josephine began, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Margaret chuckled. "Of course you weren't. Now come help me with these beds. The Carson twins managed to spill molasses all over theirs, and I'm not dealing with that mess alone." Later that afternoon, as Josephine was returning from the general store with supplies, she nearly collided with a solid form rounding the corner. "Pardon me, madam," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her, preventing her from falling. She looked up into the face of the man she now knew as Benjamin Baylor. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a clear gray blue, like the sky after a storm, and that despite the weathered quality of his skin, he couldn't be much older than 30. "The fault is mine, Mr. Baylor," she replied, stepping back and adjusting her grip on her basket. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Surprise flickered across his face. "You know my name. My aunt mentioned it. I'm Josephine Stewart, Margaret Sullivan's niece." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Sullivan mentioned you'd be staying with her. Recently arrived from back east, I believe." "Boston," she confirmed. He studied her for a moment, then gestured to her basket. "Allow me to carry that for you, looks heavy." "That's very kind, but I can manage," Josephine replied, somewhat taken aback by the offer. In Boston, a gentleman would certainly assist a lady, but she was no longer in Boston, and she had quickly learned that frontier courtesy operated by different rules. "I've no doubt you can," he said with a slight smile that softened the hard lines of his face, "but my mother would roll over in her grave if I let a lady struggle with a heavy load while I stood by." Reluctantly, she handed over the basket. As they walked toward the boarding house, she found herself stealing glances at her companion. Unlike the polished gentleman of Boston society, Benjamin Baylor exuded a quiet, unassuming strength. His clothes were simple but clean dark trousers, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and that worn leather vest. The pistol at his hip and the knife sheathed on his belt marked him as a man prepared for the dangers of frontier life. "Mrs. Sullivan tells me you're staying indefinitely," he said, breaking the silence. "That's right. Boston's loss is our gain, then." There was no flirtation in his tone, just a simple statement. When they reached the boarding house steps, he handed back her basket. "Thank you for the company, Miss Stewart. I expect I'll see you around town." "I expect you will, Mr. Baylor." He tipped his hat once more and strode back toward the hitching post where his horse waited patiently. Josephine watched him go, feeling oddly unsettled by the brief encounter. "Benjamin Baylor carrying your basket." Margaret raised an eyebrow when Josephine entered the kitchen. "That's something I never thought I'd see." "He insisted," Josephine explained, unpacking the flour and sugar she'd purchased. Margaret gave her a considering look. "He's a good man, like I said. Came out here about 5 years ago. Built that ranch from nothing. Doesn't come to town much except for supplies and the occasional social gathering." She paused. "Lost his wife and child during the war. Fever took them while he was fighting for the Union. Doesn't talk about it, but everyone knows." Josephine felt a pang of sympathy. How terrible. "Life out here is full of terrible things," Margaret said matter-of-factly, "but we endure. Now help me start dinner. The Millers are arriving on the evening stage and they'll be hungry." Over the following weeks, Josephine settled into a routine at the boarding house and began to feel less like an outsider in Silver Creek. She even made a few acquaintances, including Sarah Jenkins, the young woman who ran the town's small library, and Thomas Green, the cheerful clerk at the general store. She saw Benjamin Baylor occasionally, usually from a distance, as he conducted business in town. Sometimes he would acknowledge her with a nod or a touch of his hat, and once he stopped to exchange pleasantries when they crossed paths outside the post office. Each time, Josephine found herself inexplicably flustered by his presence, a reaction she attributed to his imposing stature and direct gaze rather than any personal interest. Summer gave way to fall, bringing cooler temperatures and the annual Harvest Festival, Silver Creek's largest social event of the year. The entire town gathered in the meadow by the creek, bringing food, music, and games to celebrate the season's bounty. "You'll need something better to wear than that," Margaret declared the morning of the festival, eyeing Josephine's plain work dress. "This is all I have," Josephine reminded her. The few fine dresses she'd brought from Boston were woefully impractical for her new life and had been carefully packed away. Margaret disappeared into her room and returned with a dress of deep blue cotton, simply cut but with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. "This should fit you. I made it last year but never wore it. Blue was always more your mother's color than mine." The dress did fit, almost perfectly, and when Josephine looked in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized herself. 3 months of hard work had changed her physically. Her face was more tanned, her posture straighter, her arms stronger. But there was something else too, a confidence in her eyes that hadn't been there when she stepped off the stagecoach. The festival was already in full swing when they arrived. Tables laden with food lined one side of the meadow, while musicians played lively tunes on fiddles and guitars at the other. Children ran about playing tag, dogs barked excitedly, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. "Margaret, Josephine, over here." Sarah Jenkins waved from a blanket spread beneath a large cottonwood tree. They joined her, and Josephine found herself drawn into conversations with various townspeople, many of whom she now knew by name. As the afternoon progressed, Josephine helped serve food, participated in a 3-legged race, partnered with 10-year-old Emily Carson, the doctor's daughter, and even joined in singing when the schoolchildren performed a series of folk songs. It was during a moment of rest, as she sat sipping lemonade and watching the dancing that had begun in a cleared area near the musicians, that a shadow fell across her. "Miss Stewart," Benjamin Baylor said, removing his hat, "you're looking well. The West agrees with you." She looked up, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Baylor, thank you. I'm finding that it does." He gestured to the empty space beside her on the blanket. "May I?" She nodded, and he lowered himself to sit beside her, his movements fluid despite his size. He dressed for the occasion in a clean white shirt and dark vest, though he still wore his pistol at his hip, a reminder that even during celebrations, the frontier remained a place where danger might appear at any moment. "Are you enjoying the festival?" he asked. "Very much." "It's quite different from the social gatherings I'm used to." "Better or worse?" She considered this. "Different. There's a genuineness here that was often lacking in Boston society events." He nodded, seeming to understand exactly what she meant. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as couples twirled to the music. "Would you care to dance, Miss Stewart?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. Yes, I would." He stood and offered his hand, helping her to her feet with an easy strength that made her feel almost weightless. As they walked to the dancing area, she noticed several people watching them with interest. Clearly, Benjamin Baylor asking someone to dance was not a common occurrence. The musicians had just begun a waltz, slower and more sedate than the lively reels they'd been playing earlier. Benjamin placed one hand at her waist and took her right hand in his left, maintaining a respectful distance between them as they began to move to the music. "I must warn you," she said, "I'm accustomed to dancing on polished ballroom floors, not grass." A slight smile curved his lips. "And I learned to dance in army camps during the war. We'll manage between us." And they did. After a moment of adjustment, they found a rhythm together, moving smoothly across the grass. Josephine was surprised at how easily he led her, his steps sure and confident despite his claim of limited experience. "You mentioned you fought in the Union Army," she said. "My father did as well, though he never saw combat. He supplied provisions to the troops." Something flickered in Benjamin's eyes, a shadow of memory perhaps. I was with the 1st Colorado Cavalry, saw action at Glorieta Pass, among other places. I've heard my aunt speak of that battle. She says it saved the Western Territories for the Union. That's what they say. His tone suggested he didn't care to elaborate, and Josephine didn't press. The war had left deep scars on many, and not all were visible. As the music continued, she became increasingly aware of his hand at her waist, warm and steady, of the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, of the way his eyes, so often guarded, seemed to soften when they met hers. When the waltz ended, he stepped back and bowed slightly. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Stewart." "Thank you, Mr. Baylor." They rejoined the others, and though Benjamin stayed nearby for a while, engaging in conversation with Dr. Carson and the mayor, he didn't ask her to dance again. Later, as the sun began to set and lanterns were lit around the meadow, Josephine saw him mount his horse and ride away, a solitary figure against the darkening sky. "Well," Margaret said as they walked home that night, "that was interesting." "What was?" Josephine asked innocently. Margaret snorted. "Don't play coy with me, girl. Half the town is talking about Benjamin Baylor dancing with you. Man hasn't danced with anyone since he came to these parts." Josephine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It was just a dance, Aunt Margaret." "Maybe so." Margaret gave her a sidelong glance. "But I've known that man for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." Josephine didn't respond, but that night as she lay in bed, she found herself replaying the dance in her mind, the feel of his hand guiding her, the unexpected grace of his movements, the intensity in his eyes when they met hers. It was just a dance, she told herself firmly, nothing more. But in the weeks that followed, she found herself looking for Benjamin whenever she was in town, feeling a small thrill when their paths crossed, and an inexplicable disappointment when days passed without a sighting. October brought an early snowfall that blanketed Silver Creek in white. The boarding house filled with travelers stranded by the weather, keeping Josephine and Margaret busy from dawn until well after dusk. It was during this busy time that the letter arrived. Josephine recognized her mother's handwriting immediately and retreated to her room to read it in private. The contents were brief but devastating. "My dearest Josephine," her mother wrote, "your father has forbidden me to contact you, but I cannot bear our separation any longer. He intends to disinherit you formally at the end of the year if you do not return and agree to the match with Mr. Blackwell. I have pleaded your case, but his mind is set. Please, darling, consider coming home. The West is no place for a young woman of your breeding and education. I miss you terribly. Your loving mother." She read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Then she sat by the window, watching the snow fall as darkness descended, turning the street into a ghostly landscape of shadows and white. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. "Josephine," Margaret called, "are you all right? You missed dinner." "Come in," she answered, hastily wiping her eyes. Margaret took one look at her face and the letter clutched in her hand and sighed. "Your mother." Josephine nodded and handed over the letter. Margaret read it quickly, her expression hardening. "Your father always was a stubborn man," she said when she finished. "Stubborn and proud to a fault." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Will you go back?" "I don't know." Josephine stared out at the snow again. "Part of me wants to. I miss my mother, my friends, the life I knew. But the thought of marrying Mr. Blackwell." She shuddered. "I cannot do it, Aunt Margaret. I would rather live in poverty here than in luxury as his wife." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "Then you'll stay." It wasn't a question. "And you'll make a new life here. Many have done it before you." "Is it really possible?" Josephine asked. "To build a new life so completely different from everything I've known?" "I did," Margaret said simply. 15 years ago, I left everything behind to come west. My family, my position, my prospects, all of it. People said I was mad, that I'd die of exposure or Indians or loneliness. But here I am. She gestured around the small room. It's not grand, but it's mine. I built it with my own hands and wits. Josephine studied her aunt's face, seeing the strength and determination there. Why did you leave, if you don't mind my asking? Margaret was quiet for a moment. For love, initially. A man I couldn't have back east. He died in a mining accident 2 years after we arrived. She smiled sadly. But by then, I'd fallen in love with the West itself, the freedom, the possibility, the room to breathe. I couldn't go back. She rose and patted Josephine's hand. Sleep on it. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But as days passed, Josephine found herself no closer to a decision. The thought of returning to Boston and her father's ultimatum filled her with dread. Yet the idea of never seeing her mother again was equally painful. She threw herself into her work at the boarding house, hoping physical exhaustion would bring mental clarity. It was during this period of indecision that disaster struck. A chimney fire, started by a careless traveler smoking in his room, spread rapidly through the boarding house's upper floor. Josephine was in the kitchen when she smelled the smoke, and by the time she and Margaret had evacuated all the guests, flames were visible through the upstairs windows. The town's volunteer fire brigade arrived quickly, forming a bucket line from the creek to the burning building. Josephine joined them, passing buckets until her arms ached, watching in horror as the place that had become her home was engulfed in flames. Josephine! A voice cut through the chaos, and she turned to see Benjamin Baylor pushing through the crowd. He was covered in soot, his shirt sleeves rolled up, clearly having just arrived and joined the firefighting effort. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine," she assured him, continuing to pass buckets. "But the house?" He glanced at the building where the fire was still raging despite the brigade's efforts. "Where's your aunt with Dr. Carson?" She inhaled some smoke. Benjamin nodded grimly. "Keep your distance. These old wooden structures go up like kindling." By dawn, the fire was finally extinguished, but the damage was catastrophic. The entire second floor was destroyed, and what remained of the ground floor was badly damaged by smoke and water. Margaret, released from Dr. Carson's care, stood beside Josephine, staring at the ruins of 15 years of work. "Well," she said finally, her voice raspy from smoke inhalation, "I suppose that's that." Josephine slipped an arm around her aunt's waist. "We can rebuild." Margaret shook her head. "With what?" "Everything I had was in that building, including all my savings." She sighed heavily. "No, I think this is a sign. My sister has been writing for years, asking me to come home to Philadelphia. Perhaps it's time." But Josephine began, then stopped, unsure what to say. If Margaret returned east, what would become of her? As if reading her thoughts, Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "You have choices, Josephine. You always have choices." The townspeople rallied around them in the aftermath of the fire. The Carsons offered them temporary lodging, while others contributed clothes, food, and household items salvaged from the ruins. A collection was taken up to help Margaret, though the amount raised was far less than would be needed to rebuild. 3 days after the fire, as Josephine was sorting through the few possessions they'd managed to save, Benjamin Baylor arrived at the Carson home, asking to speak with her. "Miss Stewart," he said when she met him on the porch, hat in hand, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Baylor." "Please sit." She gestured to one of the chairs. He remained standing. "I've heard that Mrs. Sullivan intends to return east." "Yes, she has family in Philadelphia who have been urging her to return for years." "And you?" His gaze was direct, almost uncomfortably so. "Will you return to Boston?" Josephine looked away across the town to the mountains beyond. I don't know. My father has made it clear that I'm only welcome if I agree to marry a man I cannot respect or love, but my mother. I see. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I have a proposition for you, Miss Stewart. She turned back to him, surprised. A proposition? Yes. He shifted slightly, the only sign of any discomfort. I find myself in need of a wife. Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon, a wife, he repeated. My ranch is growing. I've recently secured a contract to supply beef to the army outposts in the territory. I need someone to help manage the household to make a home. He met her gaze steadily. I'm offering you marriage, Miss Stewart. A partnership. She was too shocked to speak for a moment. Mr. Baylor, we barely know each other. I know enough, he said simply. I know you're strong, adaptable, and not afraid of hard work. I know you left a life of comfort rather than compromise your principles. Those are qualities I admire. But marriage should be based on more than admiration, she protested. Perhaps, but many successful marriages have been built on less. He paused, then added, I'm not a wealthy man by Eastern standards, but my ranch is prosperous and growing. You would want for nothing that's in my power to provide, and I would never ask you to do anything against your conscience. The practical part of Josephine's mind recognized the sense in his offer. Without Margaret and the boarding house, she had few options in Silver Creek. She could seek employment as a teacher or shopkeeper, but such positions for women were scarce. She could return to Boston and face her father's ultimatum, or she could accept Benjamin Baylor's proposal and become the wife of a rancher. May I think about it? She asked finally. He nodded. Of course, I'll be in town until tomorrow afternoon. He put his hat back on and turned to go, then stopped. One more thing, Miss Stewart. I'm not asking for love. I don't expect it. But I do believe we could build a good life together if you're willing to try. With that, he descended the porch steps and walked away, leaving Josephine to stare after him in bewilderment. That night, she confided in Margaret about Benjamin's proposal. Well, her aunt said, he's certainly direct. What should I do? Josephine asked. It seems so impersonal. Margaret considered this. Marriage out here often is at the start. It's a practical arrangement as much as anything else, but that doesn't mean it can't become more. She studied Josephine's face. The question is, can you see yourself building a life with him, not just enduring but truly living? Josephine thought of Benjamin, his quiet strength, his unwavering gaze, the gentleness in his hands when he'd steadied her that day on the street. She thought of the way he'd looked at her as they danced, and how he'd come searching for her during the fire. I might, she admitted. But it's all happening so fast. Life happens fast out here, Margaret said pragmatically. But I'll tell you this, Benjamin Baylor is a good man, honorable. He wouldn't offer if he didn't mean to see it through properly. She took Josephine's hand. Whatever you decide, make sure it's what you truly want, not just what seems easiest or most practical. Josephine barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Benjamin at the general store discussing feed prices with the proprietor. When he saw her, he excused himself and joined her outside. Mr. Baylor, she began, then faltered. How did one respond to such a proposal? Have you decided? He asked, his expression giving nothing away. Yes, she took a deep breath. I accept your offer with one condition. A hint of surprise crossed his features. Which is? That we agree to be honest with each other always, no matter how difficult the truth might be. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Agreed. He extended his hand as if to seal a business arrangement, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused. We can be married tomorrow before your aunt leaves, unless you'd prefer to wait. "Tomorrow is fine," she said, surprised by her own certainty. And so, just 1 week after the fire that had destroyed her refuge, Josephine Stewart became Mrs. Benjamin Baylor in a simple ceremony performed by the town's justice of the peace. Margaret stood as witness, along with Dr. Carson and his wife. Josephine wore her blue dress, one of the few items salvaged from the fire, and Benjamin wore a clean black suit that looked as though it had been carefully preserved for important occasions. The ceremony was brief, the justice reciting the traditional vows with a businesslike efficiency. When Benjamin slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, his mother's, he had explained earlier, Josephine felt a strange mix of emotions. Apprehension, certainly, but also a curious sense of rightness, as if some invisible thread of destiny had been leading to this moment all along. "Well, Mrs. Baylor," Benjamin said as they left the justice's office, "welcome to your new life." The journey to the Double B Ranch took most of the afternoon. They traveled in Benjamin's wagon, loaded with supplies from town and Josephine's few possessions. As they left Silver Creek behind, following a well-worn trail northward, Josephine watched the landscape change, rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain, stands of pine and aspen breaking up the open grassland. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed by the wild grandeur of the country. "It can be harsh too," Benjamin replied. "Winters are long and hard, summers bring drought and sometimes fire, but yes, there's beauty in it." As they crested a hill, he drew the wagon to a halt. "There," he said, pointing. "That's the Double B." Below them stretched a valley cut by a winding creek. Near the water stood a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, smoke curling from it into the clear air. Several outbuildings surrounded it, a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and corral. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range, small dark shapes against the golden grass. "It's larger than I expected," Josephine admitted. "We've grown over the past few years. I started with just 50 head of cattle in that cabin." He nodded toward a smaller structure near the creek. "Built the main house 2 years ago." He clicked to the horses, and they continued down the hill. As they approached, Josephine saw activity around the building's men moving between the barn and corral, smoke rising from what must be the bunkhouse chimney. "How many men do you employ?" she asked. "6 full-time hands, more during roundup and branding. Good men, all of them. They live in the bunkhouse except for Miguel and his wife, Sophia. They have the cabin by the creek. Miguel's my foreman, Sophia helps with cooking for the men." They reached the yard, and Benjamin brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. Before Josephine could move to climb down, he was at her side, offering his hand. She took it, acutely aware that this simple courtesy was now his right as her husband. The door of the house opened, and a woman emerged, short and plump, with graying black hair and a kind, weathered face. "You're back," she exclaimed, then stopped short at the sight of Josephine. "Sophia," Benjamin said, "this is Josephine, my wife." Sophia's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with pleasure. "Wife, Senor Ben, you marry and not tell anyone." She hurried forward and took Josephine's hands in hers. "Welcome, Senora, welcome to Double B." More introductions followed as the ranch hands gathered, curious about the newcomer. Miguel, Sophia's husband, was a dignified man with a quiet manner similar to Benjamin's. The other men, John, Thomas, Charlie, Peter, and young David, barely 20, were a mix of ages and backgrounds, but all treated Benjamin with obvious respect and Josephine with cautious courtesy. As darkness fell, Sophia insisted on preparing a special dinner to celebrate, shooing Josephine away when she offered to help. "No, no, Senora. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow is time enough to work." The meal was served in the main house's comfortable kitchen, hearty beef stew. fresh bread, and a sweet pudding that Sophia proudly declared was her grandmother's recipe. The conversation flowed more easily than Josephine had expected, with the men sharing news from town and Benjamin discussing plans for moving part of the herd to winter grazing grounds. After dinner, Miguel and Sophia returned to their cabin, and Josephine found herself alone with Benjamin for the first time since their hastily arranged wedding. An awkward silence fell between them. "I'll show you the rest of the house," Benjamin said finally, lighting a lamp to guide them through the gathering darkness. The house was larger than it appeared from outside: 2 bedrooms, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, Benjamin's small office, and the kitchen where they'd eaten. The furnishings were simple but well made, many crafted by Benjamin himself, he explained. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. A narrow bed with a colorful quilt stood against one wall, a chest of drawers and small writing desk against another. "Mine is across the hall if you need anything." Josephine turned to him in surprise. "We won't be sharing a room." Benjamin met her gaze steadily. "I meant what I said in town, Josephine. This is a partnership. I won't expect. That is, I don't assume." He cleared his throat. "You've had enough changes thrust upon you. I won't add to them by demanding a husband's rights until you're ready, if ever." She stared at him, moved by his consideration and somewhat disconcerted by it as well. "That's very gentlemanly of you." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I try to be on occasion." He placed the lamp on the bedside table. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." He was right about that. Josephine woke before dawn to the sounds of activity outside, men calling to each other, horses nickering, the clatter of equipment. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Sophia already preparing breakfast for the hands. "Ah, Senora, you are early." "Good." Sophia handed her an apron. "You help with eggs. Men, they eat like wolves." By the time Benjamin entered the kitchen, Josephine had helped prepare enough food to feed an army: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and strong black coffee. He stopped in the doorway, watching as she confidently served the ranch hands who came in from their morning chores. "You didn't have to do this," he said when the men had taken their food outside to eat in the crisp morning air. "I want to earn my keep," she replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I'm not afraid of work, Benjamin." He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. "I never thought you were." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Josephine learned the workings of the ranch household from Sophia, who proved to be a patient teacher despite the language barrier. She learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove, to preserve vegetables from the kitchen garden for winter, to make soap from rendered fat and lye. She learned the names and functions of tools and equipment she'd never seen in Boston, and gradually began to understand the cycle of ranch life, the relentless daily chores punctuated by seasonal activities like branding, roundup, and harvest. Benjamin was often away during daylight hours, working with the men to move cattle, repair fences, or cut hay. But each evening they would share a meal together, sometimes with Sophia and Miguel, sometimes just the 2 of them. During these quiet dinners, they began to learn about each other in a way they hadn't before: favorite foods, childhood memories, books they'd read, places they'd seen. Josephine discovered that beneath Benjamin's reserved exterior was a thoughtful mind and dry sense of humor. He'd been educated in St. Louis until the age of 16, when his father died, and he took over the family's small freight business. He'd sold it to enlist when the war broke out, and afterward, unable to face returning to a place filled with memories of his late wife and child, had headed west to start anew. In turn, She told him about her life in Boston, her education at a prestigious girls' school, her love of literature and music, her mother's gentle guidance and her father's ambitious plans for her future. She spoke of the growing tension in her family as she'd reached marriageable age, and her father had begun arranging introductions to potential husbands of his choosing. "Did you ever consider accepting any of them?" Benjamin asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the first snow of November falling softly outside. "One," she admitted. "James Harrington. He was kind, well-read, with progressive ideas about women's education. I think I could have been content with him." "What happened?" She smiled ruefully. "His family lost their fortune in bad investments. Suddenly, he was no longer a suitable match in my father's eyes." Benjamin shook his head. "Eastern society seems to value the wrong things. And Western society doesn't," she challenged gently. He considered this. "We have our own failings. But out here, a person is judged more by what they do than by their name or fortune." He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "A man who can't pull his weight doesn't last long, no matter who his father was." As winter settled over the ranch, Josephine found herself growing accustomed to her new life, the physical demands, the isolation, the close quarters shared with a man who was still, in many ways, a stranger. Benjamin remained true to his word, treating her with unfailing courtesy and respect, maintaining the separate sleeping arrangements he'd established on their first night. But something was changing between them, a subtle shift that Josephine couldn't quite name. She found herself watching Benjamin when he wasn't aware, the confident way he handled the horses, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to Sophia's grandchildren who visited occasionally, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. And sometimes, she would look up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. December brought heavy snow that isolated the ranch for days at a time. With outdoor work limited by the weather, Benjamin spent more time in the house, repairing equipment, keeping accounts, and sometimes simply reading by the fire while Josephine sewed or baked. These quiet moments of domestic companionship were new to both of them, yet surprisingly comfortable. On Christmas Eve, Benjamin surprised her with a gift, a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. "I made it," he said as she traced the design with her fingers, "for your letters and such." "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the skill it represented. "Thank you." She had a gift for him as well, a knitted scarf in soft blue wool, matched to the color of his eyes. She'd worked on it in secret during the long evenings, her first attempt at such a project. "It's not perfect," she warned as he unwrapped it. "The stitches are uneven in places." He ran his fingers over the wool, then wrapped the scarf around his neck. "It's perfect to me. Thank you, Josephine." That night, after Sophia and Miguel had returned to their cabin following the festive meal they'd all shared, Benjamin and Josephine sat by the fire, the house quiet around them. Snow fell heavily outside, visible through the small windows as white flakes against the black night. "I received a letter from my mother today," Josephine said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The post rider delivered it just before the snow started." Benjamin turned to look at her. "Good news, I hope." "Mixed." She stared into the fire. "She was relieved to hear I'm safe and settled. But my father remains unmoved. He has formally disinherited me, as he threatened." She tried to keep her voice steady, but a tremor crept in. "I knew it was coming, but still." Benjamin moved from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa. "I'm sorry, Josephine." "It's silly to be upset," she said, blinking back tears. "I chose this path. I knew the consequences. Knowing doesn't make it hurt less." Hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm against hers, the calluses from years of ranch work rough but somehow comforting. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice, a brave choice." She looked up at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. "Do you?" "Yes." His eyes held hers. "You chose freedom over security, principles over convenience. That takes courage." "Or foolishness," she said with a weak smile. "Sometimes they look the same from the outside." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so gentle it made her throat tighten with emotion. "Your family tried to disown you. I said I'd give you my name instead. I hope you don't regret accepting." The simplicity of his statement, the raw honesty in it, broke something loose inside Josephine. All the emotion she'd been holding back, grief for her old life, fear of the new, confusion about her feelings for this man who was her husband but not truly her husband, came flooding out in a rush of tears. Benjamin seemed startled by her reaction, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he tentatively put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," she managed between sobs. "It's everything, all of it." He held her until the storm of tears subsided, his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her outburst, he handed her his handkerchief without comment. "I don't regret it," she said after she'd dried her tears. "Accepting your offer, being here." She looked around the snug room, at the fire burning cheerfully in the grate, at the Christmas greenery Sophia had insisted on hanging, at the man beside her. "I'm starting to feel like this could be home." Something flickered in Benjamin's eyes, hope, perhaps. "I want it to be, for both of us." Later, as Josephine prepared for bed in her small room, she replayed the evening in her mind, the warmth of Benjamin's arms around her, the tenderness in his voice, the way his eyes had lingered on hers. For the first time since their hasty wedding, she allowed herself to consider that this arrangement, begun as a practical solution to both their problems, might become something more. The new year brought clear, bitterly cold days that turned the landscape around the ranch into a sparkling wonderland of white. It also brought changes to Josephine and Benjamin's relationship, subtle at first but increasingly undeniable. It began with small things: his hand at the small of her back as they walked between buildings, her fingers lingering on his when she passed him coffee in the morning, shared smiles over private jokes that the others didn't understand. The distance he had so carefully maintained began to shrink, day by day, until Josephine found herself wondering when, not if, the final barrier between them would fall. The answer came on a night in late January, during the worst blizzard of the winter. The wind howled around the house, finding every crack and crevice, making the solid log walls seem suddenly insubstantial. Josephine lay awake in her bed, shivering despite the extra blankets she'd piled on, listening to the storm's fury. A soft knock at her door made her sit up. "Yes." The door opened and Benjamin stood there, a lamp in one hand, concern on his face. "Are you all right? I thought I heard you moving about." "Just cold," she admitted. "The wind seems to be coming right through the walls." He hesitated, then said, "My room is warmer. It's on the lee side of the house. You could." He stopped, clearly unsure how to phrase the offer. Josephine made the decision for both of them. She rose from the bed, wrapped her quilt around her shoulders, and followed him across the hall. His room was indeed warmer and larger than hers, with a bed wide enough for two. Benjamin set the lamp on the bedside table, casting a pool of golden light in the darkness. "I can sleep in the chair," he offered, gesturing to a wooden rocking chair in the corner. Josephine shook her head. "Don't be ridiculous. It's your bed." They looked at each other in the lamplight, the sound of the storm fading into the background as tension built between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with possibility. "Josephine," Benjamin said, his voice low, "I need to be clear. If you stay, I'm not sure I can." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "That is, I want." "I know what you want," she said softly. "I think I want it too." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Are you sure?" "There's no hurry. We have time." In answer, she let the quilt slip from her shoulders to pool at her feet, leaving her standing in only her nightdress. Benjamin drew in a sharp breath, his eyes darkening as they moved over her. "Josephine," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, his hands gentle as they cradled her face. She responded hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, her arms sliding around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, and Josephine felt a heat building inside her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Benjamin's hands moved down to her waist, then her hips, drawing her firmly against him so she could feel the evidence of his desire. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her neck, "and I will. Just say the word." "Don't stop," she whispered back. "Please don't stop." What followed was a revelation to Josephine. Her mother had spoken only vaguely of a wife's duties, describing them as something to be endured rather than enjoyed. But there was nothing to endure in Benjamin's touch, only pleasure, building in waves that left her gasping and clinging to him as if she might drown without his anchor. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath the blankets, her head on his chest and his arms around her, Josephine felt a sense of completion she hadn't known was possible. This, she thought, was what marriage was meant to be, not the cold arrangement her father had planned for her, but a union of bodies and hearts, freely given and joyfully received. "I've wanted to do that since the harvest festival," Benjamin confessed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Since I saw you in that blue dress, looking like something out of a dream." She smiled against his skin. "Why didn't you?" "I promised not to pressure you. I wanted you to come to me when you were ready, not because you felt obligated." Josephine raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "I didn't come to you out of obligation, Benjamin. I came because I wanted to, because I—" She paused, suddenly shy, "because I care for you, deeply." He reached up to touch her cheek. "And I for you, Josephine, more than I thought possible." It wasn't quite a declaration of love, not yet, but it was enough. They fell asleep in each other's arms, the storm raging outside forgotten in the warmth they'd created between them. From that night forward, they shared a bed and a life in the truest sense. Winter gradually gave way to spring, bringing new tasks and challenges as the ranch awakened from its snowy slumber. Calving season kept Benjamin and the hands busy day and night, while Josephine took on more responsibilities, managing the household. She wrote regularly to her mother and occasionally to Margaret, who had settled comfortably back into Philadelphia society, but confessed to missing the wide open spaces of the West. Her father remained intransigent, refusing to acknowledge her letters, but Josephine found that the pain of his rejection had dulled with time and distance. In April, when the first wildflowers began to dot the hillsides and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Josephine discovered she was with child. She waited until she was certain before telling Benjamin, choosing a quiet evening when they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I have news," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. He turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised in question. "We're going to have a baby. In November, I think." Benjamin went completely still, his expression frozen. For a moment, Josephine feared she'd miscalculated, that the memory of his lost child would make this news unwelcome rather than joyful. Then he was on his knees beside her chair, gathering her hands in his. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. She nodded. "Quite sure." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, and she felt him trembling. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance at fatherhood, for making this house truly a home, for being you, Josephine." He released her hands to place his palm gently on her still flat stomach. "I love you. I should have said it before now." Joy bubbled up inside her like a spring. "I love you too, Benjamin. I think I have for some time." His smile was radiant, transforming his face in a way she'd never seen before. He pulled her from the chair into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I'll keep you both safe," he promised. "Whatever it takes." The months that followed were the happiest of Josephine's life. Her body changed as the child grew within her, and Benjamin's protective tenderness increased with each passing week. Sophia fussed over her, sharing traditional remedies for morning sickness and fatigue, while Miguel quietly rearranged the men's work schedules to ensure someone was always nearby in case of need. In June, they received an unexpected visitor. Josephine was in the kitchen garden, harvesting early peas, when the sound of an approaching rider drew her attention. Shading her eyes against the bright sunlight, she watched as a woman on horseback came up the trail from town, a woman whose straight-backed posture and proud bearing were unmistakable even at a distance. "Mother!" Josephine breathed in disbelief as the rider drew closer. She dropped her basket and hurried to the yard, arriving just as Elizabeth Stewart dismounted with the grace of a woman who had ridden horses since childhood, a skill Josephine had inherited but rarely had occasion to use in Boston society. "Josephine," her mother said, removing her riding gloves. "You look blooming." Josephine self-consciously smoothed her hands over her rounded belly, visible beneath her simple cotton dress. "Mother, what are you doing here? How did you find me? Your letters, of course. Did you think I wouldn't come when I learned I was to be a grandmother?" Elizabeth's composure slipped, revealing the emotion beneath. "Oh, my darling girl, let me look at you." They embraced, tears flowing freely on both sides. When they finally pulled apart, Josephine saw that Benjamin had arrived from the fields, standing at a respectful distance. "Mother, this is my husband, Benjamin Baylor. Benjamin, my mother, Elizabeth Stewart." Benjamin stepped forward, hat in hand. "Mrs. Stewart, this is an unexpected honor." Elizabeth studied him with the critical eye of a mother assessing her daughter's choice. "Mr. Baylor, I understand I have you to thank for giving my daughter a home when her own family failed her." "No thanks necessary, madam. Josephine has given me far more than I could ever give her." Something in his tone or expression must have satisfied Elizabeth, for she nodded slightly. "Well, perhaps you'd be so kind as to bring my luggage. I assume there's somewhere I can stay for a few days." "A few days," Josephine repeated. "But father, your father is in Europe on business," Elizabeth interrupted. "What he doesn't know won't hurt him. Now, shall we go inside? I've had a long journey, and I'd like to sit down." Over tea in the kitchen, a far cry from the formal parlor where they would have received guests in Boston, Elizabeth explained that she had finally reached her limit with Edward Stewart's stubbornness. "He refuses to even speak your name," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "As if you never existed. I endured it as long as I could, but when your letter arrived mentioning the child..." She looked at Josephine's belly. "Some things are more important than pride or propriety. I had to come." "I'm so glad you did," Josephine said, reaching across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. As am I, though I must say, this is not at all what I expected. Elizabeth glanced around the simple kitchen. When you wrote that you'd married a rancher, I pictured something quite different. Benjamin, who had remained silent during much of the conversation, raised an eyebrow. Disappointed, Mrs. Stewart. On the contrary, Mr. Baylor. Your home is modest but well kept, and my daughter looks healthier and happier than I've seen her in years. I believe I may have misjudged the West. Elizabeth stayed for 2 weeks, gradually shedding her Eastern reserve as she adapted to the rhythm of ranch life. She helped with cooking and gardening, learned to collect eggs without frightening the hens, and even rode out with Benjamin one afternoon to see the extent of the double Beatakes holdings. Most importantly, she spent time getting to know her son-in-law, often engaging him in long conversations about books, politics, and the future of the Western territories. By the time she prepared to return east, it was clear she had developed a genuine respect for the man her daughter had married. "You chose well," she told Josephine on their last evening together, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies rise from the grass. "He's a good man. Not what your father would have chosen, certainly, but right for you. Do you think father will ever forgive me?" Josephine asked, the question that had lingered in her heart finally finding voice. Elizabeth sighed. "I don't know, my dear. Edward is a proud man, and he feels your choice was a rejection of everything he values." She patted Josephine's hand. "But he may yet surprise us. Grandchildren have a way of softening even the hardest hearts. Will you tell him about the baby? Yes, and about Benjamin and this place. He may not listen, but he will hear." Elizabeth's expression grew determined. "And I'll keep telling him until it sinks in that he's missing his daughter's life out of sheer stubbornness." The next morning, they said their goodbyes with promises of letters, and perhaps another visit after the baby was born. As the wagon carrying Elizabeth back to town disappeared down the trail, Benjamin put his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "She's formidable, your mother." Josephine smiled through her tears. "She is. I come by my stubbornness honestly. I never doubted it." He kissed the top of her head. "Come inside, Mrs. Baylor. You shouldn't be on your feet too long." She rolled her eyes at his protectiveness, but allowed him to lead her back to the house, their home, the center of the life they were building together. Summer passed in a haze of heat and activity. The ranch prospered, with the Army contract providing a steady income that Benjamin reinvested in better breeding stock and additional land. Josephine's belly grew rounder, the child within becoming more active with each passing week. In early November, just as the first snow dusted the higher elevations, Josephine went into labor. Sophia sent for the midwife from town while Benjamin paced anxiously outside the bedroom door, barred from entering by strict tradition. After 16 hours of labor hours that Benjamin later said aged him by years, their son was born. A robust baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. "James Benjamin Baylor," Josephine announced when Benjamin was finally allowed into the room, cradling their son with a mixture of exhaustion and radiant joy. "James?" Benjamin questioned, gently touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "After my grandfather, if that's all right with you." "It's perfect," he assured her, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "He's perfect. You're perfect." As Benjamin held his son for the first time, his face a study in wonder and love, Josephine felt a sense of completion that went beyond physical satisfaction or emotional happiness. This was belonging in its truest sense to this man, to this child, to this life they had created together. Winter settled over the Double B Ranch, bringing with it the quiet isolation that Josephine had once feared but now embraced. The world narrowed to the snug house, the necessary chores, and the miraculous daily changes in their son. Benjamin moved his office into the sitting room so he could work on the ranch accounts while Josephine nursed the baby nearby. Their peaceful domesticity occasionally interrupted by James's lusty cries or Benjamin's dry observations about cattle prices. In February, a letter arrived from Philadelphia from Edward Stewart to his daughter. Josephine's hands trembled as she broke the seal, Benjamin watching her face closely as she read. "He acknowledges James," she said finally, looking up with tears in her eyes. "He says a Stewart grandson deserves his birthright, regardless of circumstances." She swallowed hard. "He's established a trust fund for James's education." Benjamin's expression tightened. "And you, does he acknowledge you?" "Not explicitly. But he signs it your father, not just his name." She refolded the letter carefully. "It's a beginning." Benjamin nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind her words. A beginning is something. The rest can come with time. Spring brought new calves, fresh growth, and renewed energy to the ranch. As the days lengthened and warmed, Josephine found herself increasingly drawn to the outdoors, often carrying James in a sling across her chest as she tended the expanding garden or simply walked the property, pointing out birds and animals to her wide-eyed son. One evening in late May, as sunset painted the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink, Benjamin suggested they ride to the top of the ridge overlooking the ranch. They left James with Sophia, who shooed them away with a knowing smile, and mounted the horses. Benjamin had saddled his own gelding, and a gentle mare that Josephine had begun riding again after James's birth. At the top of the ridge, they dismounted and stood side by side, looking down at the valley below, at the house with smoke curling from its chimney, at the barns and corrals, at the cattle grazing in the lush spring grass, at the creek winding silver through it all. "I came up here the day after I bought this land," Benjamin said, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. "Stood right here and tried to imagine what it could become." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I never imagined this. Are you disappointed?" She asked, echoing the question he'd once posed to her mother. He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "How could I be? 5 years ago I was alone with nothing but memories and regrets. Now I have a wife I adore, a son who amazes me daily, and a future I'm actually looking forward to." He touched her cheek gently. "You saved me, Josephine Baylor." "We saved each other," she corrected, leaning into his touch. "When my family tried to disown me, you gave me your name. But you also gave me a home, a purpose, a love I never thought I'd find." She smiled up at him. "Not bad for a hasty marriage of convenience." Benjamin laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past year. "Convenience had very little to do with it, at least on my part. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up to that stagecoach driver your first day in Silver Creek." "You saw that?" she asked, surprised. "I see everything about you, Josephine. I always have." He pulled her close, his arms strong and secure around her. "And I always will." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, they stood together on the ridge, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life richer and more fulfilling than either had dared to hope for. In the years that followed, the Double B Ranch prospered and grew. James was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Sophia, born in the summer of 1876, and later by another brother, Matthew, who arrived in the snowy winter of 1878. Edward Stewart eventually relented enough to visit his grandchildren, though relations between father and daughter remained formal at best. Margaret Sullivan returned west after 5 years in Philadelphia, declaring that civilization had grown unbearably dull, and opened a new boarding house in Denver that quickly became the most respectable establishment in the city. And Josephine and Benjamin. They weathered the challenges that came their way: drought years and harsh winters, economic downturns and political upheavals, with the same strength and determination that had brought them together. Their partnership, begun as a practical solution to mutual problems, deepened into one of the great loves of the Colorado Territory, often cited by neighbors and friends as the standard to which other marriages should aspire. On their 10th anniversary, Benjamin presented Josephine with a gift: the deed to a small house in town, to be used during the worst winter months, or whenever she wished to enjoy the growing amenities of Silver Creek, which had evolved from a dusty frontier settlement into a thriving small town. "So you won't feel trapped out here," he explained as she examined the document. Josephine shook her head, smiling at his misunderstanding. "I've never felt trapped, Benjamin, not since the day I accepted your proposal." She set the deed aside and took his hands in hers. "Don't you understand? The moment my family tried to disown me for choosing my own path, I was free. And when you gave me your name, you weren't binding me to you, you were giving me the freedom to become myself." Benjamin gathered her close, his embrace still as strong and reassuring as it had been on that snowy Christmas Eve when they'd first truly found each other. "And who are you, Josephine Baylor?" She looked up into the face she loved, weathered now by years of sun and wind, but still handsome, still dear. "I'm a rancher's wife, a mother, a gardener and cook, a Western woman." Her smile widened. "And I wouldn't trade this life for all the privilege and position Boston could offer." "Nor would I," Benjamin said softly, bending to kiss her with the tenderness that had never diminished over their years together. "Not for all the cattle in Colorado." As twilight settled over the Double B Ranch, the sounds of their children's laughter drifted from the house: James showing his siblings a trick with string, Elizabeth practicing her reading, little Matthew attempting to whistle. The future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the western sky, a future they would continue to build together, day by day, season by season, year by blessed year.